Nolan Wells. He's the 18-year-old whose death during a 4th of July boat trip to a remote Mississippi island is igniting nationwide debate. The video of Nolan is just so heartbreaking. He seems like such a happy kid. Now, the Daily Mail has identified a 19-year-old young woman who Nolan was last seen speaking to. Now, his friends said he chose to stay behind on Horn Island with that woman. But the woman's sister is claiming that's not true. He was ready to get back on the boat that he came on. Are all these differing accounts and a lack of understanding concerning to you?
Jennifer Coffindaffer spent hours with everything the public has been given about how Nolan Wells died. The surveillance footage, the witness statements, the Coast Guard radio traffic, the documented pull of the current around Horn Island. And she reached a conclusion. It looks like an accident. But she didn't stop there. And the second half of what she said is the reason this case still refuses to close. She doesn't fully trust that the public has the whole story yet.
Well, I think two things can be true at once. It makes sense that he went off to see about a girl, as they say, and that they had conversation and that he decided to go back and be with friends. So I think it's more of a timing issue rather than something that is untrue on either end. I think both can be true at the same time.
Nolan's death is going to the Mississippi grand jury. The DA said something interesting, that the evidence will not be public until the grand jury reviews it first. The DA says this is to protect the integrity of the investigation and that the grand jury will ultimately decide if someone will be charged. Jennifer, do you believe someone could be charged in his death? Is this just an accident gone terribly wrong?
Well, with what we know, in other words, review of all the surveillance information we have, with actually getting to hear from one of the witnesses, one of his best friends that was there throughout the situation, listening to the calls that were made, the Coast Guard contact, as well as the riptide situation in that area. When you add it all together, what we see publicly seems to be an accident. Having said that, of course, there's going to be information. 60 witnesses interviewed. I doubt if this, from what we know, will come back with the true bill.
All right. Hopefully the families, both families, get some answers. Jennifer Coffindaffer, thank you. I'll see you soon.
Sit with those two statements together, because that tension is where this entire case actually lives. A trained investigator, working from the same public record everyone else has access to, is telling you the evidence leans toward tragedy over crime. That same investigator, almost in the same breath, is telling you she wouldn't be shocked if the full truth is still sitting somewhere the public hasn't seen. Neither statement cancels the other out. Both are coming from the same person in the same conversation. Before going further, it's worth knowing who's talking. Coffindaffer spent nearly 3 decades as an FBI special agent, working organized crime, gangs, narcotics, and counterintelligence, and serving on the Bureau's SWAT teams in Houston and Dallas. She's not a studio guest improvising an opinion for the cameras. She built an entire career reading crime scenes and interviews for a living. And she's now applying that same instinct as a law and justice contributor for NewsNation to a case the public is trying to understand in real time, right alongside her. So what is she actually looking at? Nolan Wells was 18 years old, a wide receiver at Southwest Mississippi Community College, an athlete his father had spent years developing on the practice field and in the gym. On the 4th of July, he rode out to Horn Island, a remote barrier island roughly 10 miles off the Mississippi coast, with no shelters, no facilities, and no cell service, on a boat with 3 friends he'd known since high school. It was a holiday. The island was packed with people, and at some point that afternoon, Nolan didn't get back on that boat. His 3 friends returned to the mainland without him. 2 days later, a park ranger found his body in the water near the island's northwestern tip. That much is settled. What happened in between is the entire case. The sheriff's office said publicly that no foul play was suspected, not even an hour after his body was recovered, by his mother Christine's account, and that speed is a big part of why she's never simply accepted the official version of events. It made both her and her husband Elmore uncomfortable, she said later. Why are we so quick to rush to this? So the family did something most grieving parents never have the resources or the resolve to pursue. They had their son's body flown to Washington, D.C. for a second independent autopsy from a pathologist with no ties to Mississippi law enforcement. They hired civil rights attorney Ben Crump, and within 3 weeks, a local drowning case had become something far bigger. It's now pulled in the NAACP, which has formally called for a federal review. It's pulled in the FBI, assisting with threats made against people connected to the case. It's headed toward a Mississippi grand jury, and it's attached to a reward fund that's climbed to $125,000, financed by Reverend Al Sharpton, filmmaker Tyler Perry, and Pro Football Hall of Famer Terrell Owens. Nolan was black. The 3 friends he was with that day were white. In a state carrying Mississippi's specific history, that fact was never going to stay in the background. And for his family, it's part of why a fast, tidy answer was never going to be enough. Investigators have since interviewed roughly 60 people trying to reconstruct that day. Friends, strangers, boaters, anyone who might have been on Horn Island when Nolan was. This isn't a case built on a handful of accounts from people who already knew each other. It's dozens of separate versions of the same afternoon, still being weighed against whatever physical evidence eventually surfaces. That's the weight sitting on top of this case. Coffindaffer's assessment is an attempt to look past that weight and read only what's actually verifiable underneath it. To understand why she leans toward an accident, while still not being at peace with that lean, you have to understand exactly what she examined to reach it, piece by piece, and exactly where that evidence stops giving answers. That's what the rest of this documentary is for. Not picking a side, not performing certainty in either direction, just walking through what a trained investigator actually sees in this case, and being honest about the exact point where her own confidence runs out. If cases like this are the kind of thing you want covered carefully, from verified reporting rather than speculation, this is a good moment to subscribe before we keep going. And if you've ever spent time on water like Horn Islands, drop where you're watching from in the comments. A lot of people already understand exactly how fast that kind of current can turn dangerous. Start with the water itself, because that's the first thing Coffindaffer actually pointed to, and it's more specific than just, he drowned. Horn Island doesn't have a dock, a lifeguard, or a single building. It's a barrier island, 10 miles of sand and pine scrub sitting out past the last reachable point of the Mississippi coast. And on the 4th of July, it was covered. Boats stretched for what witnesses describe as miles around it. Thousands of people. When boats were tied up along the shallows, the water ran waist deep off the stern and neck deep off the bow, shifting by the step. That's the terrain the sheriff's office has had to reconstruct, after the fact, from a holiday crowd nobody was tracking in the first place. That matters more than it sounds like it should, because of something water safety researchers have understood for decades, and most people still don't. Real drowning does not look like drowning. In a 2006 article for the Coast Guard's own On Scene journal, a researcher named Francesco Pia gave a name to what actually happens to a person in trouble in open water. And it's almost nothing like what film and television have trained people to expect. There's no shouting, no frantic waving. The body's demand to breathe overrides every other instinct, including the ability to call out. And a drowning person's arms move instinctively to press down on the surface rather than wave for help. From even a short distance, a person actively drowning can look almost unremarkable, right up until they're gone. Layer that over a beach with thousands of strangers, none of them specifically responsible for watching any one person, and an accidental drowning becomes considerably easier to picture without requiring anyone to have done anything wrong. That's the environment Nolan Wells was in that afternoon. Here's what his friends say actually happened inside it. According to Warren Hudson, who says he'd been close with Wells since the two were in 8th grade, the group had been drinking through the day as the crowd around them kept growing, and Wells seemed completely fine. At some point, Wells struck up a conversation with a girl he'd just met. His friends say that's why he chose to stay behind when the rest of the group decided to head back. And they say it wasn't a quiet decision. Hudson has said Wells was told repeatedly to get on the boat before they left, and didn't. Wells' phone stayed behind with the boat, which Hudson says was normal practice for the group, done to keep phones dry rather than to hide anything. A second friend who was there that day, Trayston Shepard, has given a similar account, that Wells wanted to stay behind with the girl. Wells' family has pushed back on how close Shepard and Wells actually were, but the core detail lines up with Hudson's. Getting off the island, by Hudson's own description, was chaotic. The boat had started taking on water, forcing a hurried exit for everyone on it. That account has now collided with a second one. The girl has since been identified as 19-year-old Katie McCormick, who was on the island that day with an entirely different friend group. According to her older sister, Gracie, Katie's version doesn't match the one Wells' friends have given. Katie didn't believe she was the reason Wells stayed behind at all. She assumed, once their conversation ended, that he was heading back to the boat he'd arrived on. Katie assumed the friends telling him to get on the boat wouldn't have left him, Gracie told the Daily Mail. Katie left the island shortly after, picked up separately by her brother and his fiancée. She hasn't been accused of any wrongdoing, and her family says she's cooperated fully with investigators. So which version is true? Attorney Ben Crump has called this the case's central contradiction. One side says Wells stayed, the other says she thought he'd already left. Coffindaffer, looking at the same conflict, reaches a notably calmer conclusion. She doesn't think it necessarily means somebody's lying. "I think it's more of a timing issue," she said, rather than something that is untrue on either end. In other words, a group of friends could honestly believe Wells stayed with Katie, and Katie could just as honestly believe Wells left with his friends, if something simply shifted in the few minutes after their conversation ended. A version of events that requires nobody to be lying, just two groups of teenagers each walking away with an incomplete picture of the same afternoon. That reading is exactly why Coffindaffer's overall assessment leans toward accident, crowded water, a documented dangerous current, a scientifically silent way to drown, and a conflict between witnesses that looks less like a cover story and more like ordinary human error under chaotic conditions. It's a coherent, defensible picture. It is also, notably, not the only piece of evidence in this case. A second, independent examination of Wells's body, one his family commissioned almost immediately, unwilling to simply accept the initial finding, turned up something that doesn't fit neatly into that picture at all. And it's the reason even Coffindaffer, the person making the strongest public case for an accident, still isn't ready to call this case closed. Within a week of Nolan Wells' disappearance, his family did something that doesn't happen in most drowning cases. They flew his body to Washington, D.C., and paid for a second autopsy, performed by Dr. Roger Mitchell, a board-certified forensic pathologist and president of the National Medical Association. They did it because the first conclusion, delivered so quickly, never sat right with them. What Mitchell found didn't hand them a clean answer. It handed them something more complicated, a result that keeps every possibility on the table at once. Mitchell examined Wells' body on July 10th, 6 days after he disappeared, and filed his report on July 19th. His most notable finding was a 12 by 8 inch area of red discoloration in the deep, soft tissue at the back of Wells' skull, over the occipital bone. He couldn't say what caused it. What he could say is what it wasn't. No skull fracture underneath it, no cut in the skin above it, and after an extensive dissection of Wells' face, the back of his head and neck, his ribs, pelvis, back, and limbs, no other deep tissue injuries anywhere else on his body. A violent, sustained assault typically leaves more than one ambiguous mark behind. This autopsy didn't find that. It found exactly one unexplained thing, and nothing else. That single finding is doing a lot of work in this case, and it's worth being precise about what it actually proves. On its own, an area of unexplained discoloration doesn't confirm trauma, and it doesn't confirm foul play. It's also not nothing. It's the one detail in an otherwise unremarkable body that Mitchell couldn't explain, and in a case this contested, unexplained is not the same as irrelevant. Here's what makes it harder to resolve than it should be. By the time Mitchell examined Wells's body, several things had already happened without him. The state's original examiner had retained key structures from Wells's throat, his trachea, laryngeal cartilage, and hyoid bone, and those were never sent along for the second exam. Mitchell said that's typically done when a pathologist has some specific concern about the neck worth investigating further, though he was careful to frame that as his own assumption, not confirmation of what the original examiner actually found or suspected. Either way, without those structures, he couldn't examine Wells's neck for the kind of injury that would matter most in a case like this one. His organs had also already been dissected during the first autopsy, meaning Mitchell couldn't directly check the airway and lungs for water, or the stomach for its contents, the details that most directly confirm an ordinary drowning. And by July 10th, 6 days of decomposition had already begun hiding bruising that would have been obvious immediately after death. Toxicology results from either autopsy weren't back yet either. Add all of that up, and Mitchell's own conclusion isn't a verdict. It's a list of missing pieces. He wrote that he could not rule out whether any intervening, non-accidental factors contributed to or caused Wells' death, and that investigators still need to establish exactly how Wells entered the water in the first place, whether he was conscious or unconscious, and whether he went in on his own or was put there. That's not Mitchell contradicting Coffindaffer's read on the case. It's Mitchell explaining, from an entirely different professional lane, precisely why her hedge exists in the first place. An investigator working from surveillance footage and witness accounts can reasonably lean toward accident. A pathologist working from an incomplete body, missing key structures, already decomposing by the time he saw it, cannot fully close that door from his side of the evidence, no matter which way he privately leans. That gap is exactly why this case is now headed to a Mississippi grand jury, rather than being closed at the coroner's desk. Jackson County District Attorney Angel Myers-McElrath has been direct about what that step does and doesn't mean. Every death in the county, other than natural deaths and non-criminal car accidents, goes to a grand jury as a matter of routine, she said, and Wells's case is being handled no differently than any other. The evidence, including whatever the state's own autopsy eventually shows, will stay out of public view until that jury reviews it, a decision her office says protects the integrity of the process, not the kind of thing that withholds the truth out of indifference. For a family that's already waited weeks for basic answers, that restraint has been difficult to accept on faith. But procedurally, it's exactly what her office says it is. Not a signal that charges are coming, and not evidence that they aren't. So the picture, 3 weeks in, looks like this. A trained investigator who leans toward accident, based on the water, the crowd, and the science of how people actually drown. A forensic pathologist who can't rule out something worse, based on what he wasn't given to examine. And a legal process built specifically to hold both of those possibilities open until there's enough evidence to close one of them for good. What's missing from all three isn't a theory, it's data. 3 new pieces of information have surfaced since Mitchell's report, and each one moves the needle differently. The first is audio. Mississippi's Department of Marine Resources released a recording of a call made from the water that afternoon, after one of the boats in Wells's group started taking on water. On the recording, a teenager can be heard asking the owner of a nearby boat, a 21-year-old, according to MDMR records, for help, at one point asking him to jump in and deal with the boat's drain plug while it was still underway. A towing company, Sea-Tow, was contacted, but never actually dispatched. By the time they were ready to respond, the boat's owner said help had already arrived from someone else on the water. It's a chaotic few minutes, captured almost by accident, and it lines up with what Hudson and others have already said publicly. The exit from Horn Island wasn't calm. Worth noting, Hudson himself wasn't on Wells's boat that day. He'd traveled separately, spoken with Wells a couple of times on the island, and headed back later on a different boat, the one that started taking on water. The second is official paperwork, not just interviews. A Mississippi Department of Marine Resources police report, obtained by ABC News, documents what several friends who traveled to the island with Nolan told investigators directly, that when they left, he was in the company of a woman they didn't know, and that he'd chosen to stay behind. That's the friend group's account, now sitting inside a formal law enforcement record rather than a television interview. The same reporting includes GPS data recovered from the boat Wells rode out on, showing it departed for Horn Island at 9:56 that morning. It's a small, precise data point, but it's exactly the kind of objective record that can eventually be checked against every account given so far, the friends and Katie McCormick's alike. As of now, no discrepancy between that data and the stated timeline has been publicly reported. The same preliminary materials include something less comfortable: witness accounts describing Wells as having consumed a significant amount of alcohol that day. That detail isn't a judgment on anyone. It's directly relevant to the one test that can still meaningfully separate these possibilities from all the rest: toxicology. Neither the state's results nor Mitchell's are back yet. Combined with the water conditions and the instinctive drowning response described earlier, impairment is exactly the kind of ordinary, unsinister factor that could turn a strong swimmer's afternoon fatal without anyone doing anything to him at all. That difficulty isn't unique to this case either. Forensic pathologists broadly agree that drowning is one of the hardest determinations in their field to make with certainty, because there's rarely a single autopsy finding that proves it happened that way. A body recovered from open water, especially several days later, often can't tell a pathologist definitively whether someone drowned unassisted, was incapacitated first, or something in between. That's not a flaw specific to Mitchell's exam, or the state's. It's closer to the norm for cases like this one, which is part of why toxicology and scene reconstruction end up carrying so much of the weight people instinctively expect an autopsy to carry on its own. Here's what still hasn't arrived: the state's original autopsy, sealed until the grand jury convenes. Full toxicology from either exam. The completed forensic review of Wells's phone, which Crump's team and Jackson County agreed to inspect jointly, specifically to determine whether anything was deliberately deleted or whether its apparent emptiness has an ordinary explanation. Until those three things surface, nobody, not the family, not the sheriff's office, not Coffindaffer herself, has enough to close this out with real confidence. It's worth sitting, for a moment, on why an accident wouldn't actually end this story, even if it turns out to be the full answer. In April, a case with striking similarities unfolded on Lake Ray Hubbard, outside Dallas. 18-year-old Daniel Irving, the only black member of his friend group, drowned on a fishing trip. Nobody was charged in his death. Two of his white companions have since been charged separately for what they did afterward, discarding his phone and clothing and deleting their text messages with him once they realized an investigation was coming. That case didn't require revisiting how Irving died. It only required proving that specific people made specific choices once he already had. If anything similar happened here, a grand jury wouldn't need to reopen the question of drowning to still hold someone accountable for what came next. Nothing currently confirmed suggests that happened in Wells's case, but it's a real, precedented outcome, and it's part of why accident and nobody will ever answer for anything aren't automatically the same sentence. For Christine and Elmore Wansley, none of this waiting has gotten easier. They've sat through a funeral, a press conference at the NAACP's national convention, and weeks of their son's final hours playing out in public, and they still don't have the one thing they asked for from the beginning: a real answer, arrived at carefully, rather than a fast one delivered before anyone had actually looked. Which brings this back to where it started. When you add it all together, Jennifer Coffindaffer said, what we see publicly seems to be an accident. That's a professional's honest read of a genuinely difficult case, not a guess and not a dismissal. It's also, by her own admission, built entirely on what's public, in a case where the most consequential material, the state's autopsy, the full toxicology, the completed phone review, still isn't. Both of those facts are true about her assessment at once, and neither one makes the other less honest. Some of that missing material will likely surface in the weeks ahead. A grand jury will eventually see evidence the public still hasn't, and whatever it decides, it should be built the way a decision like this has to be, on toxicology and forensics and a completed phone review, not on which version of the story felt more satisfying to believe in the meantime. Right now, the most accurate thing anyone can say about how Nolan Wells died is the thing his family has been saying for nearly a month. Not yet answered, still being investigated, and owed, at minimum, the patience to get it right.